Great to see everyone today, to be together and enjoying a great crisp morning before it starts to bake us in the afternoon. So I hope you got out and were able to enjoy that this morning. Thanks, Rollin. No, we're good. I thought you were going to bring me my guitar so I could sing.
Oh, come on.
I've been dying. I used to play in the band in the very early days, and I got kicked out. So today, we're continuing this series, and we're exploring this idea, this sort of season as we head into the fall, of what is it that we actually want in the center of ourselves, and how do we find this? How do we find the fullness of life that we're longing for that's promised in Jesus? There's a lot of verses. If you've been around the church, you've heard people talk about Jesus or the church. You've heard things like, I came to give you abundant life. I came to set you free, and all these kinds of ideas that sound good to us. But a lot of times we don't really understand how to experience them. We don't really find ways to experience them in the life that we actually live. And a lot of this is really hinged upon what happens to us in our center, in the center of ourselves, this place that we're sort of calling the soul, and how this affects us. The scriptures teach us in Proverbs, it talks about the idea that our lives flow from the innermost parts of ourselves. It would use our innards, our hearts. These would all be the words that would be used to describe this place inside of us where our lives come from. And one of the things that we talk about around here is when we think about our lives, we talk about surrendering our all. We're not just talking about trying to go, God, I'm gonna give you everything I have. One of the things that we use this acrostic when we talk about all. That somehow what happens to us in our center actually makes its way into our actual lived life, right? The life that you actually live. What we're asking, what we're learning to do is to surrender our all. We're surrendering the life that we actually live. Not all the ideas or things we ought to be doing, but the things that we actually do in our day-to-day world. To let Christ have rule and reign in those places. His will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's the target. That's what we're after today in our mission at Port City Community Church. We want to reach people and help them walk with God. And the reason is because I believe, and I'll just speak personally, that you will not find the life that you were looking for apart from a relationship with Him. You've been made by God and for God. We say this all the time. And it's not like we're up here, the experts, going, we're going to teach you how to walk with God. We're going to help you walk with God. It's really a posture of us learning how to do this together. And that's really what's required of us. It's all of us living in relationships, pursuing Christ individually with our own sort of personal worlds, but also collaborating and living and experience this together, helping one another do this together. We need each other to experience the fullness of life that we long for, not just to experience it sort of in a tangible way, to actually receive it and find it and understand it. We need one another to do that, and that's our posture in this. And so what I want us to do today is I want to kind of draw, this is how I think about things. So if you're new here, you'll just kind of get a window into my brain. But there's something that has to source our center. And if you've been around for a while, you'll notice this looks a lot like encounter, formation, expression. It's something we see or encounter. There's a source that moves into us that affects us in the center of who we are. And then out of that place, it makes its way into the way we actually live our lives. And Jesus, talks about this. And what I want to do today is give you a literal, I was going to say a vision for what fullness looks like, but I want to give you a visual for what fullness might look like for you. And so, the reality is that our lives are an expression. Your life is an expression of your character, of what's happening in the center of your life. And your character is formed by what it is that you encounter. It's informed or formed or transformed by what it is that you worship, by what gets your affection, by what gets your attention. It's formed by what you love. And so Jesus said it like this, and this is one of the main, kind of distinctives of Jesus' teaching, especially as it collided with the Pharisees and a lot of the religious leaders of his day. That we just think if we can just do enough right things that somehow we'll be okay. And we try to utilize or use our behaviors to sort of govern our inner world, thinking that we can just get our outside lives correctly. It'll somehow make its way into finding the peace and joy and fulfillment that we're looking for. And it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. And this is how Jesus says this, and he just kind of echoes what I drew up here. Or actually, I'm echoing what he said. I guess is the better way to say that. And this is just super practical. It makes perfect sense. In Luke chapter 6, he's talking to religious leaders, and he says, "No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. This just makes sense, right? Apples don't come from pear trees, they come from apple trees. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart. And an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. Whatever you are full of is what's going to come out of you at some point in time, right? That's what we think about this. So the question is, what is it that we are full of? Where does this come from? Where does this come from? We need to have the kind of center. And a lot of us, again, we live in a world that just doesn't seem to be letting up. We don't get a break in almost anything. This has been my experience for the last, it's so we kind of joked in 2012, Richie Marshall, he's our executive pastor, we said, man, if we can just get through 2012, we'll be all right. We've been saying that ever since. Every year, like, if we can just get through this year, and it's always something. And honestly, the last couple of years have been some of the hardest of my lives in some personal ways. For those of you who know, my mom last Sunday morning, early Sunday morning, overnight, fell and broke her hip. So we've been dealing with that all weekend and just did a lot of things going on. And you just kind of look around and go, and then you watch the news or anything else. We all have personal stuff, but it doesn't seem to be relenting. We don't seem to be getting a break from anywhere. And I don't know if it's just the avalanche of the news and information we have, or if it's just there's a lot of ways to think about this. But it hasn't changed the fact that we need the kind of center, you need the kind of center, I need the kind of center in our lives that can withstand the world in which we live. And this is precisely what Jesus promised. He made no bones about it. In John 16, when he's talking to his disciples, he says, in this world, you will have trouble. That was the promise. In this world, you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. There's something he has offered us, a peace, a way of life that he's offered us that isn't subject to the circumstances, the conditions that we live in. We need to learn how to live in a way, finding the stability for the life that we actually long for. We need something more. And so I want to highlight a few ideas today of wisdom and integrity and humility, some big ideas that we would all say, oh, those are good things. I want to show you how they relate to each other, but they are sourced in a way that actually allows us to live and begin to experience this in our actual lived lives, the life that you actually lived where you are, whether you're raising kids or working a job or trying to figure out what you want to do, all the different things, wherever you are, your actual lived life, it makes its way there. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 9, and there's many places like this where it speaks of these sort of principled ideas. And it introduces the idea of integrity. It says, whoever walks with integrity walks securely. Whoever walks with integrity walks security. The currency for finding security isn't money, it isn't financial freedom, it's something that happens in the center. It's a solidity here. It's a strength here that provides a security for whatever the world throws at you, whatever happens in the world around us. Those who walk with integrity walk securely, but the crooked, whoever walks crooked paths, will be found out. And it's this idea of sort of hiding and concealing, and we'll spend some time talking about that. But this is what integrity actually does for us. Integrity isn't just about you doing what you say you're going to do. Integrity, of course, has an element of truthfulness to it, but it's even deeper than that. It's more than that. It's built on something that has a foundation that allows for us. It's sourced from something that can actually survive or sustain us when the world seems to be coming apart. Integrity provides a stability that is not threatened by your circumstances or my circumstances. Henry Cloud wrote an entire book called Integrity, and I sort of took his definition and modified it a little bit, but I think it's a great way for us to think about this, that integrity is having the character to meet the demands of reality. The character to meet the demands of reality, that your life, right, has a reality to it that requires something from you and something of you. It's either going to split you apart or it's going to allow you to be strengthened and to find something about yourself and to learn how to live in the fullness and the freedom and the peace that Jesus has promised for us. And so I want us to look, if you have your Bibles, we're going to look in the book of James. And it's way back in the back, and James is a great book because it's super practical. It's kind of like Proverbs of the New Testament. But I want us to look at this because a lot of us have heard some of the verses in here. I've actually taught on them before, but I want to share a couple of things about this. The first thing that we'll notice, I'm going to sort of start to fill this out. But when we talk about our center, there's sort of two places where we are formed, right? One is this idea that there's a disintegration in ourselves. And you just have to kind of assess where you are. That somehow we're divided. We find ourselves having to justify ourselves to one group of people at the expense of another group. There's just sort of this disintegration inside of ourselves. That we say one thing in one circumstance and we say another in other circumstances. There's sort of a double-mindedness. There's a hesitation. We feel like we have to conceal things or justify things. There's not a sense of freedom and fullness. There's a disintegration. And then the opposite side of that is the idea that we are integrated, that there's a sense of wholeness to us. And this is precisely what integrity is. The idea of, if you remember in middle school math when they taught you about integers, they taught you about real whole numbers, right? Integer means whole. Integrity is whole. It's that there's no division. We're not divided. There's no and I don't mean disintegrated like you're evaporating. I mean like disintegration. There's something happening and all of us have to test ourselves in this. And so what gets produced out of these kinds of lives? Last week, or in the first week of this series, I said what happens to us when we don't have something that governs our center, the default is going to be ourselves. We're going to be self-centered. And self-centered isn't like, oh, you're a selfish pig and you should be ashamed of yourself. Self-centered is the default that happens to us when we don't learn how to find a center that is sufficient. Self-centered. And self-centered expresses itself in our demand of other people and circumstances to fill us. This is what gets expressed in your actual lived lives. You find yourself pulling and grabbing and grasping. Sometimes you find yourself manipulating other people, and we do this in all sorts of ways, right? Some of us do this very deliberately. Others of us are very subtle, and we're very good at it. We learn how to get people to feel the way that we think we deserve to feel by manipulating, by saying things, by putting out eggshells or demanding things from them. And so all of this happens in this disoriented, disintegrated life, and it always sort of acts on itself. The more you learn how to live like this, the more disintegrated you become. And a lot of us, the more disintegrated we become, the more comfortable we get in our disintegration. We learn how to manage it. But you will never be whole, you'll never be full, you'll never be free. That's sort of the tension that we're addressing here. And so the opposite of this idea of integrity is that we're disintegrated. There's a duplicity to us. And I want you to hear what James has to say about this. And you may be familiar with this passage because it talks about consider it all joy when bad things happen, right? This is the idea. James chapter 1, verse 2 through 8. And it says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. The testing of your faith, when things get pulled or pushed, that's what begins to build something in us. It causes us to stay in it. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature, complete, and not lacking anything. We live in a culture, we were just having a conversation backstage. We live in a culture where resilience is a lost art. We think as soon as something gets hard, that it's not for us, and we bail out. And oftentimes when something gets hard, right, when something gets hard, that's when you most need to sort of settle in and push through and understand, like, how's this testing of my faith? How's this stretching? What is it doing for my character, for my center? How am I learning how to be resilient in these areas? It produces maturity, and a perfection is the word, perfection, so that you will not lack anything. There'll be a fullness in you, right? That's what fullness is. We're not longing for anything. We're full. Then he asks this, and look at what he says here. This comes right out of this. If any of you lacks wisdom, like, where did that come from? He's talking about perseverance and staying in and not giving up. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. And you have to begin to ask yourself, what is the source of this kind of center that we're looking for, this kind of integrity, this wholeness that we're looking for? And he says what you need to ask for is this kind of wisdom that drives our center, that sort of helps us to discern how we can be integrated and whole and live in this way. And we need wisdom from above. That's exactly the phrase you'll hear in just a moment. So he says, if you're struggling, if you're not seeing a way forward, ask God for wisdom. Wisdom is the idea that integrates our heads and our hearts and our bodies. It's the integration. It's what sources our wholeness. That's how it would have been thought of. So we're asking God, can you help me see some things? Can you help me process some things? Can you help me understand some things? Not in some way to go, oh, I see why this happened, because it's not a jigsaw puzzle. It's learning how to navigate a chaotic world with a sense of peace and fullness and freedom. And then he goes on, so he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, and if you don't think you don't lack wisdom, then just don't ask, right? That can't help you there. But if you need something, then you ask. That's what he says. If you need wisdom, then you ask him. And he gives generously. But when you ask, and here's the condition, but when you ask, you must believe and not doubt. Because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. And that person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. For such a person is double-minded and unstable in all their ways. The person who walks with integrity walks securely. The person who doesn't is double-minded and unstable in all their ways. And here's the danger of this. I did a whole series on this in 2015 called The Shadow of Doubt. A lot of us, what we think when it says, whoever asks and doesn't doubt, then that person, then you'll get what you receive. But if you doubt, you shouldn't expect anything from the Lord. And what you're immediately trying to do is to make yourself certain. Because what you believe is that the opposite of faith is doubt. And so in order to have strong faith, you got to eliminate doubt. And in order to eliminate doubt, you got to find a way to be certain about everything that you believe or think or know. And you start finding evidence for this. But the opposite of faith isn't doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. And what he's talking about here is not trying to mine your way or find your way so that you are completely sure about everything that you know to be true. But he's calling us to walk by faith. This whole thing says if your faith is tested, your faith doesn't get untested by being certainty. Your faith gets tested by, your faith isn't tested or eliminated, isn't strengthened by certainty. Your faith is strengthened by learning how to trust when you don't have certainty. That's the big idea. You have to be able to do this. And so this is what's happening to us as we learn how to walk. This is exactly what he's talking about. This passage is about our willingness to trust. And in fact, this passage in the context of it is how do we persevere in really hard things? This whole idea when you ask for wisdom isn't about finding a way out. It's how do we endure when things aren't going right? How do we endure when the world seems to be off its rocker? How do we endure when things seem to be chaos? How do we navigate chaos faithfully and full of hope? This is what we noticed last week in the prayer that we looked at from Paul, from his prayer from Colossians. He says, I pray that you'll be strengthened with all the glorious might to have great patience and endurance, to learn how to stay in, to be resilient, so that our characters, so that our centers can be formed, so we can develop integrity. You do not develop integrity without struggle, without hardship, without difficulty. It just doesn't happen. And we continue on, and what we see here is the promises that God provides us with a sense of stability. His wisdom provides us with stability. And I'm not just talking about principles to make your life work, but rather finding the fullness of wisdom that we learn to derive from our relationship with Christ. So we'll continue on. We'll jump down to chapter 3, and you'll start to see this play itself out. Chapter 3, one page over. And it says this. And again, James is just teasing this out, and he says, who is wise and understanding among you? And here's the litmus test. Here's like the test of wisdom. Let it be shown by their good life, by the deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. Let your actual lived lives, right, be expressed or shown in this life that flows from these deeds that are done in this posture of humility. That's interesting. When I was thinking about this and writing about this in my journal, integrity and humility. These are two things that most everybody, I would assume, thinks are good things, right? Everybody believe that integrity is good to have? Yep. Everybody believe that humility is good to have? Perfect. But it's not something you can like chase down and get. You can't just go, I'm gonna be more humble today. Like you can't just do that. It's something else. It has to come from somewhere else. Integrity has to come from somewhere else. And so we have to and this is why the source is so important. And he says, if you want to know if there's humility and integrity in your life, it's just going to be seen in what you do, how you actually live your life, how you arrange your life. With the things that you do when no one else is looking. right? Those are the places where our character really gets tested. And then he says this, and this is just, it's almost like comes out of nowhere. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. For such wisdom, I love this, such wisdom does not come from heaven, but it is earthly, it is unspiritual, and it is demonic. For where you have bitter envy and selfish ambition, you have every source, right, of disorder and every evil practice. When there's bitter envy and selfish ambition, you have full disintegration. When I thought about this, with the source over here, we talked about sin last week, that sin fundamentally operates on division and deception. And anything that is not real or true is a twisted version of what is, and we are deceived by it. And it yields bitter envy or selfish ambition. And the operating system of that usually becomes, and see if you can relate to this, because we go, oh, I don't have bitter envy or selfish ambition. I don't have those two things. But what it becomes, the way we operate, is we begin to operate in comparison and competition. Anybody? You feel that one? Okay, they'll be at the 11 o'clock service. We arrange our lives to compare ourselves to anything and everything and anyone and everyone. And now we have an instant scorecard on our phones all the time, right? We think about this with our kids. How are our kids doing in light of what everybody else is doing? Are they getting to the right schools, the right grades, the right this? And listen, I'm not saying there's no need to have sort of norms. I get all that. But it's this race to the top. One of the mantras in our household, because we did the whole thing, our kids, and you want your kids to be like star players. I get all that stuff. I felt all the pressure. And we just decided at our home, we're just not going to play those games. And the freedom that we found is you cannot lose a game you aren't playing. It became such a freeing thing. I use it all the time. When people, you can't lose a game you don't play. We're just not going to do this. Comparison. Competition, you're always trying to see where you add up and how you can get ahead of someone else and what they're doing. And it robs us of all the things we long for, to be joyful for other people and their successes. To be able to celebrate without feeling somehow that we're slighting ourselves because we are disintegrated, we are unstable in all of our ways. To be over here is to be whole and to be secure and to not have to prove anything to anyone. There's a freedom from not having to demand that other people or my job or my performance make me feel the way that I think I deserve to feel. There's something about this. We have to learn how to do this. That where there's bitter envy, this becomes the source and the expression of all kinds of ways that undermine our souls and rob us of the experience that we are designed to have as human beings, even in a broken world. As we have to, you're gonna have to test yourself on this. But James mentions another option. And he says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let it be shown, let them show it by their good life, by the deeds that are done, and the humility that comes from wisdom. He goes on, he says, this wisdom that comes from above is pure, it's peace-loving, it's considerate, it's submissive, it's full of mercy and good fruit, it's impartial, and it's sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace will reap a harvest of righteousness. Peacemakers who sow peace, who act in this way, who bring this to bear on the world around us. People whose lives sort of flow out of this. And he says that let it be shown by the deeds that are done in humility, without having to demand. Do you know what humility is? Humility isn't just, I'm nothing. That's not what I'm talking about. There's a humility that comes from wisdom. There's a wisdom that sources the kind of life that is free from proving or demanding. That our lives would somehow be marked by a way of life that finds its source in something that is unforced and free. I try to test this in my own life, and I can tell. And I tend to be a little intense and somewhat ambitious at times. That may be a little understated. But what I've learned, and I remember thinking about this when we were first starting the church, was that I remember feeling like I don't ever want to force things. I want my life to flow from what God is doing in me. I want the ministry, the tasks, the things that God has entrusted. I want those things to flow from me and not try to force them. And I can tell when I'm forcing things. I can tell when I'm pushing things. And when I do, I have to back up and say, Lord, can you give me wisdom in this place? Because what happens is as soon as I start forcing things, these two things get threatened. You start demanding that you deserve things and that this should work in your favor because you've worked harder, because then you start justifying all the things, and what you're doing is you're demanding. You're just right back over here. And as soon as that happens, you start comparing yourself to everyone, you start competing with everyone, and the whole thing starts again. We have to ask and stay centered on this. And what humility is, humility ushers in something for us that is essential for fullness, and that is grace. We have to define humility for our terms. We could put a lot of scenarios around, or a lot of definitions around this. But James did write this in just a few more verses down. He says that God opposes the proud. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And by proud, I mean self-centered, self-reliant. I can do this myself. When you believe that you have to be self-sufficient and self-reliant, you choke yourself off from the one thing that you desperately need. We'll never learn how to live in humility. Humility is the result of recognizing God's grace and our willingness to receive it. That's what it is. Humility has nothing to do with feeling bad about yourself or self-esteem. It's, Lord, I trust and believe that you have given me grace and I am willing to receive it. I am a benefactor of your benevolence, of your goodness, of your grace to me. I'm a receiver of this. And this is exactly how Jesus talked about this, or John talked about this about Jesus in John chapter 1. It's interesting that when Jesus comes into the world, John describes it like this. He said, Jesus came into his own, but his own did not receive him. But to all who would believe him and receive him, who would receive him and believe on his name, who would trust him, to them he would give them the right to become children of God. To them he would give them the right to live in this way of life. And he said, we have looked at Jesus and we've seen the fullness of the Father, and he says, full of grace and truth. So we have this picture of Jesus, or the picture of the Father in Jesus, and he's full of grace and he's full of truth. And you know what John says next? And out of his fullness, we have received grace upon grace. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Let those who long or who need wisdom ask for it. If you don't think you need grace or you don't think you need wisdom, you will never get them. It just won't happen. It is a posture, and it's not a posture of pity. I always think, why are we so hesitant to receive grace? Because we believe that we should not need anything from anybody because we should be self-sufficient. And my question to you is, how's that working out for you? How does it work when you're constantly trying to prove that you don't need, that you can do this on your own, right? And that's what toddlers do, like immediately. This is the whole deal. It's like as soon as you try to do something, like, I can do it myself. It's like, well, knock yourself out. And this is how we end up living. And the thing is, as we get older, we learn how to perform and to execute, and depending on what level we can do it and how we do with this, depends on what happens to our center, how disintegrated you end up living and how that manifests itself in the way you demand. And if you can get what you demand, you seem to do pretty well. And it masks a lot of problems all along the way, but what you don't realize is the wake of sort of the lack of fullness that you've experienced in your life when there's another way for us to live. I said last week that what Jesus came to do is to restore us to the relationship for which we've been made, and he did that by eliminating the thing that separates, and that's our sin. And that's our sin. I actually misquoted the verse. I think I said Psalm 119 last week. It's Psalm 51. But remember, this has been my own struggle as I try to wrestle, because there's a lot of places where I look at myself and I'm like, Lord, is there a sense of fullness here? There are places when I feel pressure, what is my go-to? Is it to escape? Is it to double down? What does pressure do to me? Then I have to ask myself another question. What do I want to do when I feel pressure? And I can tell you sometimes when I feel pressure, what I want to do are not good things. I want to prove, I want to show. You cannot do, you start to bow up, you feel that? What do we feel in those moments? And what I've found is the only way I know how to do this is just to sort of get myself alone before the Lord. It is out of His fullness that I receive grace upon grace. Out of His fullness, I receive grace upon grace. The reason is because grace comes in, I've said this before, grace isn't just this thing that you get and then it's done. Grace is sort of the sustaining presence, the sustaining force, the sustaining source of God's life in us as we learn to live with Him. That's what it is. It's to draw and derive life from Him. When I think about my walk with the Lord, I'm trying to learn how to take cues from how Jesus lived and the things that He valued and the things that He taught, how to embed that into my life and to draw strength from Him. Lord, give me wisdom for this moment. Help me to discern what is needed or required of me here. And it's constantly being aware of that. And what I've learned is that grace comes to us like breath. It is sufficient in the moment, only for that moment. That's what we get. And it's learning how to live from grace to grace. This is how Paul would echo this in Romans chapter 1. He says that the righteousness of God has been revealed from faith to faith, from one step to the next step. It comes to us as we learn how to dwell and to trust in Him. The testing of our trust, the testing of our faith produces a willingness to stay in. That's what brings maturity. That's what centers us and strengthens our center. We often resist grace because it feels like pity. It feels like we've done something wrong and now someone's got to do something for us, instead of recognizing that to live by grace, to live in a relationship drawing life from God, is actually the way that you are designed and created to live. And that grace isn't pity, but it's rather the promised redemption for you and I to be able to experience the fullness life for which we have been given. Out of His fullness, we receive grace upon grace. And so the thing that I cannot do for you, there's a lot of things I cannot do for you, but I cannot be honest about your center, right? You have to do that. What I have learned, I mentioned this last week, is I've just learned to be honest with God. And this was the verse that I have long used since I was in college, trying to wrestle in my own integrity, learn how to live in a way that would honor God in the privacy of my own home, in the inner world of my thoughts and my attitudes, when it didn't affect other people or even places where no one would know. And it's been a long, hard fought struggle to develop a sense of character that is actually beginning to withstand some of the pressures of the world. It's just taken a long time. I may be a slower learner than most. But he says this, behold, this is from the New American Standard Version of the Bible, Psalm chapter 51, verse 6. Behold, you desire truth in the innermost being, in the center. You desire truth in the innermost being. And what does he say next? And it is there in that place that he'll give you what? Wisdom. He'll make known to you and source the kind of character and the kind of life that learns how to live by grace. You make me known wisdom. It's the source that places me in a position to receive what reconciles and returns me. It's the place where I learn how to receive God's forgiveness as His grace expressed for me. Right? That's what this is about. The soul cannot stand to be divided. Your soul cannot stand to be divided. My soul cannot stand to be divided, but it is, and it's killing us. It is in the wholeness of our lives that we'll begin to find the fullness that we long for. It's in these places that we need grace. We don't find grace by trying to justify that you don't need it. You ever done that with God? You're trying to confess a sin to Him, but at the same time you're trying to justify why it isn't as bad. Nobody's ever done that, just me? All right, I can help you do it if you need some help. But you don't find that. We find it in confession by just being honest with God. If you're disappointed with something you've said or done, tell Him. Don't double down. Don't double down and demand and say, well, this is why I did. You to understand. No, just be in your truth, in your innermost being. It is there that he will make known to you the kind of wisdom that you need to move forward and to begin to trust in his grace and his forgiveness for you. Anything else is a lack of that. This isn't in a lack of integrity to confess our sins and to acknowledge that we aren't always the way that we portray ourselves or the way that we should be. But rather, it's an expression of integrity. It's being willing to be honest with God, to receive something from him that we cannot do for ourselves, and in fact, we have not been designed to do for ourselves. To live in forgiveness is to live in his grace, and it is in his grace, to receive grace upon grace, that we begin to find the fullness of life that our souls long for. So here's what I want you to do. I want to ask you one question, and then I'm going to give you an exercise. To think about your life flows from your center, that out of your life bears the fruit of what's happening in the center. The people around you, the way people think about you, the eggshells that they have to step on to talk to you or address you, all those things are revelation about who you are in the center of your soul. And so what I want to ask you is, what does your life reveal about the center? And I can tell you, if you don't know, the people around you do. Okay? This is just the way our lives work. We got a lot to chew on, sort of a litmus test, right? Who's wise among you? Let them show it by the good life that they live with the wisdom that comes in humility. What's happening in your center? What's governing you? What's driving those things? Is it protection? Is it demand? What is it? Is it fear? There's a way we've been created to live, right? That allows us to receive from him something that can bring the kind of fullness that we long for. What we're going to ask you to do this week is to sort of take the next couple weeks, and I'm going to invite you to tend to your soul, something we don't do very much of, and we probably don't do well at it when we do it. But it's to tend to our souls. We've got all of our devotions at portcity.church/devotions with an S. We'll have these exercises. They're contemplative exercises. They're going to walk you through to start to develop some habits, to ask some questions, to reflect on some things, to tend to your soul. I will tell you again, I would get a pen and a piece of paper. I would start to write this down, to get truthful in your innermost being and tend to the place, right, where your life is inevitably going to flow from, and find ways to receive the promise that God has given to you, that your life can actually be full. All right, so that's the challenge. 2 weeks of it. We'll pick this up next week as we wrap this series up. Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you for your grace. I know in this room, online, people listening to us in our campuses and participating with us in all sorts of different ways, that there are men and women here who have really struggled in their innermost parts. Some because of perhaps harm that's been done to them, some because of harm they've done to others, some of it's shame, some of it's anger, some of it's fear. Father, my prayer is that you would give us the courage to be truthful in our innermost being and bring that to you, that we might find a source that brings wholeness and the hope for wholeness into our lives. So, Father, I ask that your Spirit would see us and know us. God, we'd have the courage to ask others around us to pursue the kind of life that we long for. So I ask you to do that by your power and according to your work in our lives and through our lives. And I'll lift all this to the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King. Amen.